results of our new research project on culture wars in the UK, which we conducted with our excellent research partners, Ipsos Mori. We're holding this event in partnership with British Future, and we're grateful for the support of Unbound Philanthropy throughout this project. And it's been quite a long project, a long-term study. We started 9 or 10 months ago as a follow-up to a report we did with Engage Britain back in 2019 on how divided Britain really is, where we looked at polarization theory and trends. We spotted then, just at the end of that project, how we'd started to import the discussion, the terms of culture wars from the US. And we wanted to explore that in more detail, and particularly whether we can avoid it, which is the theme of the event today. So it was a big study. It includes a review of the academic literature, a big media content analysis, and then a very large-scale survey by Ipsos Mori on their new random probability knowledge panel study, a great tool. And then we did segmentation of the public into different sorts of groups, and an international survey comparing Britain, the UK, with 28 other countries. So it all ended up much larger than we had in mind when we started the study. So you'll all have been sent the report today, which is about 150 slides long. So apologies for that, but I hope it is accessible. You can at least flick through it, and it provides a resource for the future. And we have an absolutely brilliant panel to discuss the findings today, starting with Ben Page, who's Chief Executive of Ipsos Mori, who will run us through as many of the survey's findings as we can in 10 minutes in the brilliant way that only Ben can do. Then we'll have Sundar Katwala, who I think is looking forward to a different event today by the looks of it, who's Director of British Future, who do great work on finding common ground and bringing Britain together. Then we'll have Tanya Gold, who's a journalist who writes for a very wide range of titles, and who wrote a really excellent long piece for the Sunday Times magazine on culture wars. And finally, we'll have Trevor Phillips, who's a broadcaster, writer, chair of Green Park Executive Recruitment, and has lots of other really important roles in these types of debates. Then we'll have time for questions for you. We are taking questions in the Q&A function. Do get those in nice and early. But before Ben takes us through the main bit of the survey results, I just wanted to pick out 3 points from other aspects of the research. I'm just going to share my screen. While I do that, it gives me a chance to just thank the excellent authors of the report who are on the front here. Kirsty Hewlett, George Merkin, Rebecca Benson, Rachel Hesketh, all from King's, and Ben, Gideon Skinner, Glenn Gottfried from Ipsos Mori. Brilliant work. Thank you to all the people involved in that. So the 3 points I wanted to make. First one is that a culture war signals much more than disagreement, even fractious disagreement. You can see that by looking back at the US thinking on this. And the guy who coined, or at least popularized the term, James Davison Hunter, back in 1991 in a book called Culture Wars, laid it out really quite well. He sees it as a sense of conflict between two irreconcilable views of what is fundamentally right or wrong about the world we live in, a disconnect between our most fundamental ideas about who we are as Americans in that case, and how and on what terms we live together. So this isn't just about usual sorts of disagreement. That's been developed, that kind of thinking has been developed over a number of years, including great work by Liliana Mason and others who started to think about how different issues get rolled into one identity, and more and more issues get thrown into the same kind of political or social identities, which turn into mega identities. And that when these mega identities get formed, we start to think of the outgroup partisans as quite different from us, as Mason says, which makes it easier to dehumanize them, to think of them about them with less generosity. We see a lot of those strands of less generosity about the other side coming through. And then more recently, Ezra Klein, in his book on why we're polarized, talks about when you roll all these issues together into one identity, it's very easy then to, when you activate one aspect of it, you activate all aspects of that identity. And when they're activated, they strengthen. That's the kind of crucial point. The more you try to activate these types of identities, the more it becomes self-reinforcing. And that's why it's a really important debate to have right now, whether we are importing this or whether we can change a path, because it's a process that builds over time. The second point I wanted to just flag is, given that, it's really important to understand how we are talking about culture and culture wars. So that's why we did this media content analysis, where we looked at UK newspapers, all the main UK newspapers, and looked at the extent to which they've been using the term culture wars, the actual term culture wars, all the way back to 1993, and then splitting it between articles that were talking about the UK and articles talking about other countries. And the other countries was nearly all talking about the US. And you can see, looking at that line first, it goes like this. So we didn't really talk about culture wars in the US very much at all. In 1990s, 2000s, started to go up with these peaks around presidential elections. That's the dots that are marked on this. And then a big increase in discussion of culture wars in the US in 2018, 19, and 2020 because of the nature of the presidential election there. But that trend is absolutely dwarfed by the trend in talking about culture wars in a UK context, the blue line on this. So we really didn't reference culture wars in the UK at all, very much up until the mid 2000s. And then it's just taken off, particularly in 2020. Where it's hugely overtaken the US, our discussion of US-based culture wars. So in fact, in 2015, there was only 21 articles that referenced culture wars in the UK. Last year, in 2020, there was 534 articles that talked about culture wars in the UK. Really important point to make here is that this doesn't mean that culture wars is just a top-down phenomenon, that there isn't anything among the public about cultural conflict or concern about culture change. That's not true. It's bottom up as well as top down. But the crucial part, when you start to see trends like this, you have to really recognize that how the media and politicians talk about the issues is important. The language they use and the tone in which this is done is really important for setting that tone for how the system as a whole feels in terms of how polarized and divided we are. And that top-down discussion is important, but it's also important to bear in mind that from a bottom-up point of view, we don't yet have two tribes in Britain, despite what the coverage may lead you to believe. This is the segmentation analysis that we did on the survey. And really, we hear an awful lot about the two ends of this spectrum when we're in discussions of cultural change. We hear about progressives at one end of the spectrum, who are the youngest group, highest education, most likely to think women's rights, ethnic minority rights, trans rights have not gone far enough. And then at the other end of the spectrum, traditionalists, who are the oldest, most heavily male group, most nostalgic for the country's past and proud of the British Empire. In fact, we don't hear about these groups as a whole. We mostly hear about slithers of these groups. That leaves out big chunks of the population, and half of the population are not in either of those groups. So you've got 1 in 5 people in our survey, in the Ipsos Mori survey, who are disengaged, who stand up for their neutrality on politics and Brexit, and they're least likely to take a stance on culture war issues or most issues. And then a really interesting group of moderates, who are actually the largest group in the study, who support, and a really interesting difference and nuance in their views. They support greater rights for women and ethnic minorities, but agree political correctness has gone too far, but are nostalgic, but not nostalgic for the past, nor proud of empire. Really interesting mix. So obviously there's no majority in appealing only to those noisy extremes. We need more of a common ground type approach, because there is more nuance in public opinion than can appear, and it's useful even just to remind ourselves of that we need more of that. So final point 3 is just to pick out a couple of examples to illustrate that. If you break it down, a few of the questions, this one is whether people agree or disagree that when it comes to giving Black, Asian, minority ethnic people equal rights with white people, things have gone far enough in the UK. When you split that down by our 4 groups, you can see that moderates are closer to progressives on rights for these traditionally marginalized groups. Traditionalists do agree, 7 in 10 of them do agree that things have gone far enough, but nearly every progressive disagrees, but moderates are pretty close to them. So that sense of more to do on marginalized rights is a view among a big chunk of the population, but utterly different pattern when you look at political correctness and whether people agree or disagree that that's gone too far. And on this, progressives are on their own 6 in 10 of them disagree with that. Again, at the other end of the spectrum, nearly every single traditionalist agrees that that's gone too far. But the moderates, that kind of big middle group, and the disengaged, much closer to traditionalists and progressives on that type of question. So a real touchstone issue. But it shows you the difference, and Ben will pick up on this more in his presentation, shows the importance of political correctness in that kind of perspective, but also shows the nuance and difference and subtlety in people's views. This is not a simple two tribes issue. Final word from me before handing over to Ben is none of this is down to a particularly unusual generation of young or old. I've got quite a focus and obsession about generational difference, and we get asked a lot on this type of analysis, is this just about young versus old? And that's not the case when you look at our segmentation. It's not as simple as that. This is not, we can't blame snowflake millennials or Gen Z or a particularly sociopathic group of baby boomers that we have coming through now. That kind of generational framing of this is wrong. Instead, we need to look at the changing context and how the public are reacting to that, which is my segue into Ben's description of that. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I hope you can all hear me and see my screen. Whoops. Good. I am screen sharing and hopefully you can hear me. So it says it's all working. Great. Okay, so I think what's interesting about this, and I'm just going to build on what Bobby said in his introduction to the segments, and that is that for a number of reasons, there are benefits to different political interests in Britain in focusing on this. And I think this phrase is actually from somebody, allegedly from somebody in Downing Street who wants a war on woke. And I can see some evidence in the data that might suggest that there are political advantages in using this, even if it's not necessarily something that a lot of people in Britain would relate to. But we are, when we look internationally as to whether or not we think everybody else is too easily offended, you can see that Britain, Australia, America are among the countries where we think that other people are too easily offended. So we're more on that particular issue. We are quite different to, I don't know, Italy, Germany, Brazil, Peru. And we have lots of people who think everybody else is too sensitive, but also a lot of people who think that actually we do need to change the way people talk about some of these issues. So there are, as Bobby says, a lot of today's talk, and indeed the 155 page report, are about the need for a bit more nuance in discussions on this. But at the same time, we are an outlier in the sense of at least believing that, you know, there are lots of other people who are too easily offended. I think we're also a country where a lot of us believe that the country is divided, and it might be a little less divided than it actually is. In the same way, of course, that most British people are much fatter and happier than most people in Britain think they are. But a key thing is that actually, if you go into the details of some of the key phrases and words that we use, people who feel that they're familiar, the metropolitan elite, which I'm almost certain as I look around myself in central London, I'm probably a member of, you've got only 53% of the population who say they've heard much about that. Cancel culture or microaggressions, trigger warnings, even less. So white privilege, and this was before recent announcements about white privilege leading to white kids doing less well in school, or at least focus on white privilege somehow leading to white kids doing less well in school. But overall, we find that a lot of people are not particularly familiar with many of the terms that we're using. And as Bobby said at the beginning, a lot of this is about us, small minorities of people amplified by the media rowing with each other. And even on, being woke. And I thought this was fascinating, as I'm the parent of a young person who is definitely woke. As you can see, if you're my age, over 55, and you're called woke, most people my age and Trevor Phillips' age just won't know what it means. And actually, amongst everybody else, you've got a quarter who think it's a compliment and a quarter who think it's an insult. There's a difference by politics, as you might expect, but I think the age gradient, which you can see at the bottom of this chart, where for the young it's a compliment, but the old, it's not particularly an insult any more than it is for the sort of the millennials, the 25 to 34-year-olds. It's simply they just don't know what you're on about. And I think, again, we sometimes in our endless sort of attention bias that we have, particularly those of us who like things like Twitter, it's a useful corrective that for the most common response on being woke is, what are you on about? Also, it's worth reminding ourselves that although we've got a third of people who say that we're divided by culture wars, interestingly, that's much lower than the 75% who believe that we're divided as a society generally, not about culture wars, but about other things. And actually, as you can see on this chart, we're far less likely to say that we're divided by culture wars than the US, but also places like Poland, or even more nearby, our good friends in France. And I think, interestingly, on virtually every international measure that we looked at with King's College on this study, what we found was that Britain is decidedly mid-table, whether it's over gender, sexuality, ethnicity, you name it. Britain is about mid-table in terms of how divided it feels it is compared to most other countries. So this perception that we have that we're, at war with each other, etc., again, just doesn't hold up when you look at any international comparators at all. But one thing that everybody does agree on, even if their views on whether rights for ethnic minorities have gone too far or not, one thing they all do agree on is the media, Trevor. The media make our country feel more divided than it really is. And you can see that a majority of every single group in the culture wars absolutely wants to blame the media, particularly, interestingly, the traditionalists, whose lines often the media are pushing. But anyway, there you go. One group of people we can unite against, as well as our politicians. We didn't cover them there, but certainly the media are making us more divided than we should be. At the same time, we do agree that divides exist. And so this is looking at the different four groups that Bobby introduced. And we're looking here at the extent to which people feel that there is tension between the different groups. So at the top, you can see, hopefully it works. Whoop, click here, yeah. There's the disengaged, there's the moderates, there's the traditionalists, and here are the progressives. And the progressives are most likely to say that there are divisions between Leave and Remainers, most likely to say that there are divisions between rich and poor. Interestingly, those are well above between sort of the cities and the rest of Britain, men and women, or people with a university degree and those without. And interestingly, in the work that we've done looking at them, there's an interesting to see this echo of the Brexit vote still with us 5 years on. And one of the things that we found in research is that the Brexit identity, as people's behavior in the referendum of 2016, is currently still today, 5 years later, more important in people's identity than their political affiliations. It's more important to be a Leaver or a Remainer in thinking about yourself than it is to think of yourself as Conservative or Labour. But these divisions are there, and it's particularly, interestingly, the progressives who tend to see those divisions. Although, as you can see, it's not a massive difference, but there are some quite big ones there. The disengaged least likely to identify any of them, but the progressives definitely feel it. And interestingly, in work we've done with the long-term impact of Brexit in terms of people's beliefs in any culture war, interestingly, it's the people who lost in the referendum, the Remain vote, of course, who find it hardest to come to terms with the other side, whereas the Leavers who won can be a bit more generous. But certainly there are divisions over Brexit. Certainly we see in Britain divisions over being rich and poor, and we can feel that there is those tensions are there. And interestingly, when you compare Britain and America, some interesting divides. So this is the same data, but here comparing how much tension we feel there is in Britain between, say, rich and poor, or immigrants and people born in the country against the other side. So there is Britain, and you can see rich and poor, migrants, people who support different political parties. That's the proportion in Britain who say that there is tension there between these things. And in America, though, it's much greater, particularly here over politics, 20 points higher, on race, 18 points higher, and on this sort of liberal versus traditional values, again, another 18-point difference. So America generally coming out as feeling more divided than Britain, and I think social scientists on the call would probably agree that America is more polarized and divided than Britain. And my hope, of course, is that we don't import that over here as we do so many other things, although we've never quite done guns and religion in the same way as America. So maybe there is hope. But certainly the Americans are more divided over immigration and income. And in Britain, of course, we still also have class, which, of course, in America, everybody's middle class. But it's interesting that we believe that we are more divided on average than in the past. 48% say we're more divided than we were 20 years ago. Interestingly, particularly up in the north of Britain and in Scotland, less so down south. I think we need to dig into that. It's something there. But I do think in all of this, we should often, when we look at this data, we should smoke sometimes, but not always inhale completely. People, are united, as we've seen in blaming the media. They are united in their admiration for institutions like the monarchy or the NHS. And on many things, Britain is much less divided than it likes to think it is, or the media sometimes portrays it. So, looking forward to seeing the discussion. But there's another starter from me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Thanks for getting through so much. Straight over to Sundar, and just do submit your questions in the Q&A if you have them. Early questions more likely to be asked, so do get them through. Sundar.
Thank you, Bobby, and thanks very much to King's for the invitation to be part of this event. I think it's a really important question that we're asking. Can we call off a culture war, and do we need to do so? British Future is a charity. It's a non-partisan think tank. It likes to engage the public, particularly in the issues that people find divisive and potentially polarizing, in the hope that we can find more common grounds. We look a lot at issues of identity, immigration, integration, race relations in particular. And two big bits of research we've done that chime a lot with a lot of what we're seeing from the King's research. We led a major exercise called Talk Together for the Together Coalition, which is the largest public engagement in what unites, what divides, and what might we do about that. About 150,000 people took part in that during COVID, and it was interesting to see that during COVID. And we were having a lot of inter-ethnic conversations about race relations last autumn and this year. The research from King's is really, really useful. I think it illuminates the terrain in a way we haven't seen. I think it's for academics to tell us what they can find out and research about the facts of society. It's for commentators, and we'll hear from Tanya and Trevor to help us make sense of that. I think what we're hopefully starting in this event is also a question of who should do something about it. Is it for citizens? Is it for civic institutions? Can we, as well as understanding the society we live in, can we change it? There are a lot of people who wouldn't want a culture war, but where do they go and what do they do to try and call it off or moderate the temperature of it? I think I'm looking for allies in that cause. And the question comes from understanding all of the complexity and the nuance. What does that mean about how to act? And so that's what I just want to focus my remarks on. Firstly, don't just cross our fingers and hope it goes away. There are some reasons for reassurance in this research, I think, from King's College about how we're certainly not in a sort of civil war style of culture war. We might not become so, and there are reasons for reassurance. There's a polarization of two quarters in our society that's quite noisy, quite important politically, but not everybody's in it. But just hoping that means we'll call it off, I think, would be a mistake and would be too complacent. I think we can find resources in this attitudes evidence about where there's an appetite for something more temperate, an appetite for the common ground. But if you don't actually organize that, I think there are very clear dynamics where a polarization of two quarters turns into sort of 40% on one side and 40% of the other, and you're reluctantly conscripted to choose your side in the culture war, even if you actually wanted to be on the bridge somewhere in between. So crossing our fingers isn't enough. The other thing people need to stop doing when they're talking about culture wars and how to stop them is stop saying what other people with different views need to do. We need to stop saying it's all their fault. If they stopped it, if I carried on and they stopped it, we wouldn't have a culture war. And this is a particular feature, I think, of the British debate about culture wars. Everybody thinks it's a problem caused by somebody else. So many of my friends on the liberal left think the culture war is a tactical strategy cooked up in Downing Street, being pursued by aspects of the media, that all they are trying to do is pursue social justice, equality and diversity in the way that should happen, and that other people have turned that into a culture war. And the right cannot understand at all, cannot fathom why the left thinks it's the right that started the culture war. All they are doing is sitting around planning to conserve our traditional institutions when these people start these arguments about them, and they reluctantly have to turn up and defend common sense from the woke left. And so there is this mutual incomprehension about whose problem it is. And what I just want to say about that is, if your main idea about stopping a culture war is that your political opponents should stop it, we're not going to get very far. And all of the useful interventions about how to moderate or temper a culture war come essentially from what you and your friends might do differently without selling out your principles or your causes. Now, that brings me to my third point. Ask people to call off a culture war. If that means don't pursue your ideas, don't pursue your principles, don't engage in democratic debate about identity, that will be too high a price to pay. We're not going to abolish identity politics. I've got a problem with the way some people pursue certain forms of identity politics, because they're not very good ways sometimes to pursue causes I care about. But all politics is the politics of identity. Identity politics are part of a democracy. So campaigns for gender and race and sexual equality are identity politics. Anti-woke politics is definitely as much a form of identity politics as woke politics is. The politics of bridging is a politics of identity. The politics of class and broad coalitions in our society and inclusive national identities, these are politics of identity as well. So it's about the form of identity politics we want to have and how to pursue identity that matters. So I think we should not get too into the argument this is all a distraction and there's more important things that matter than identity. Actually, identity really matters to us, and how do we pursue that in a democracy? Campaigners for more liberal society in Britain have made a lot of progress in my lifetime on gender equality and feminism, on pushing back racism, on gay rights very fast, I think, and should take some confidence that you don't need to stop with where the public are. But actually, we do need to think about how to pursue these issues in a way that takes people with us. And the question of whether to polarize these debates or not, sometimes that might be a tactical question. You know, if I'm campaigning against poverty or for climate change or international development, shall I raise the heat and get the energy going, or shall I try not to do it? That might just be a tactic about what's going to work and what's not going to work. You know, is Extinction Rebellion the best way to do climate change? On these issues of identity, I think it's much more than a question of tactics. I think it's a principle that you don't want to win the argument by increasing the heat in our society on both sides, because that way of making progress actually is bad, I think, for the way we talk about immigration, race relations, minority rights. So there's a challenge there that you need to bring new voices in, as we've seen, I think, over the generations, but try to defend your principles and diffuse the polarization. That, I think, is what the non-culture war way is, to pursue more liberal approaches to identity and inclusion. If you agree with me on that, the implication is, do not see America as a model we want to import. America is a warning about what not to do, and we are less divided and polarized than America is because of geography, because of politics, the role of faith, because of the way the media works in America. But there is quite a lot in the last 5 years in Britain that has the dynamics of what was going on in America over 20, 25 years. America became more polarized because both the right and the left invested in a politics of pursuing what they wanted to pursue, but in a way that divided it. We've got resources to prevent doing that here in Britain, in our society. We've got more institutions and ideas that we share. They don't have something like the National Health Service in America that people agree on. We've got less of a debate about identity, but there's a real risk, I think, in the politics of post-2016. If it splits the cities from the towns, if it splits the young from the old, it will then split different ethnic groups, the majority and minorities, into these two tribes that are pursuing different causes. And that's what we need to stop. So clear blue water across the Atlantic in the language and discourse of how we talk about these issues. So I'm worried to see white privilege pop up as the term that has really broken through, because actually in British Futures research about race and identity and advantage and disadvantage, every other way of making the case that there is ethnic minority disadvantage to tackle and white advantage that we want to level up every other way of saying that other than white privilege is more effective. And white privilege as a term gets you into a debate about race versus class. But there is this importation through the internet of American cultural debates. Cultural appropriation is an argument that makes no sense whatsoever in Britain in the way that is pursued in America. So I think it's the white liberal anti-racist politics of liberal America that are not going to help us, and that we actually need a much more homegrown agenda of identity in Britain that leans into our history, who we are, the difficult issues we face about empire, history, race, identity. So let's not be too much, take too much from America. My last point, which is directed at the audience. You've got to turn up when the heat is on, and you've got to turn up to strengthen the middle. And too many institutions are not going to turn up. And that is how you can get a culture war that nobody wants. Because if the heat's on, you might want to just hide under the table, stay out of it. It might be divisive. We need to know who is going to turn up to provide sites of meaningful contact and dialogue in our society. And there are too few people who've thought about doing this or worked out how to do it. And I think what the King's research shows is there is a stronger appetite for the middle among the public than among the elites, but nobody is organising to bring it about. The way to call off a culture war is to reduce the sense of social distance between people of different backgrounds in your society. If you have meaningful contact from people of different backgrounds in the cities and towns, in different ethnic groups, in different generations, it's harder to get into a culture war. You need to meet the real person who disagrees with you about these issues, not the caricature that your newspaper, your media channel, your social media group tells you about them. But who is going to organise that? Because if we don't organise a stronger middle, we could end up in a culture war that nobody wants. Thanks, Bob.
Brilliant. Excellent. And that was perfect. Thank you very much. So moving straight on to Tanya next.
Hi. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm happy to represent my slightly sodden trade of journalism at the moment. And there's a couple of things that I'd like to talk about. Although I was very heartened to read the result of your research that we're not actually, like America, getting ready to monoliths, getting ready to have a war across an abyss. I don't have such good news for you from the worlds in which I work, which is journalism, politics, and Twitter. I've just come back from Batley and Spen, where, as I'm sure most of you know, there will be a by-election on Thursday because the Labour Party, the Labour MP has left to become the Mayor of the West Midlands. And it was assumed that Labour would win this seat. And now it's looking like the Conservatives are going to win it. And the reason why it's looking like the Conservatives are going to win it is because we have what looks like a classic boilerplated culture war event up there. We have a charismatic bad actor in George Galloway, who in his latest political party has come to the constituency of Batley and Spen, and there is busy trying, I'm afraid, to start a war between the people there. He is exploiting Islamophobia. He is trying to turn Muslim against Jew, Christian against Muslim, and Muslim against Muslim. And this, of course, is in a constituency whose MP Joe Cox in 2016 was murdered by a far-right extremist outside, of all places, a library. Now, I can't say why George Galloway or other culture war charismatics, such as Lawrence Fox, do what they do and say what they say. I suspect that is a matter for their childhood and for psychiatrists. But I can say that it's very easy to exploit divisions for some people under certain circumstances. We have a silent Conservative up there, and we have an almost silent Labour Party. So they are giving the floor to Galloway. And I think that is their first mistake. I don't know what's going to happen on Thursday. I hope that the Labour Party candidate wins and that they pull back from this madness. But we have seen political violence on the streets. We have seen Labour activists being pelted with eggs. Somebody was attacked. Labour Party sources say that people are driving past their offices. So it is possible to completely destabilise the polity if you have the desire and if there are those fractures to exploit. The Conservative, it looks like, is going to benefit from this. And one of the things that I find most desolate about modern politics is the way that I believe the current Conservative government is trying to incite culture war for short-term advantage. And it won't be long-term advantage, because it's not in anyone's advantage to import culture wars from America to Britain. But if you have a culture war, I mean, it's funny, you don't even need a real war these days to distract people from what's really going on. For me, who is centrist leftist, there's only one really important political issue in this country, and I think we'll have no solution to our fractures until we deal with that, and that for me is inequality. Child poverty is heading for 40%. It is going up every year. And this is in families, as everybody knows, in work poverty. We have a nation dotted with food banks, and this is all very new. And one of the things that angered me most about the coverage in Batley and Spen is that, very much as in Hartlepool, the Conservatives were saying, if you get rid of your Labour MP, it's your Labour council, all your services have collapsed because of your Labour council. And yet in the last 10 years in Batley and Spen, the Labour council has lost 74% of its central government funding. So the Conservatives are lying. They're lying about what's happening. Culture war is very convenient for them in the short term, because they don't want to talk about this. They have no solutions to it. So instead, what are they talking about? Well, there was the Magdalen Common Room issue a couple of weeks ago. Anyone remember that? When I think it was even less than 10 members of the MCR in an Oxford college voted to take their picture of Queen Elizabeth II down. And this was national news. And it was national news partly because of the media and partly because the Conservative government wanted it to be. Because then we don't have to talk about what's really happening. They talk about the National Trust, making war on our heritage, when actually, of course, the opposite is true. All these ridiculous issues are attracting attention. Proposals for free speech champions and nonsense like this. And Labour, I fear, is also falling into this trap. I'd like to talk a little bit about the media. I'm afraid that, with a few noble exceptions, the media is on board with culture war. I wish I had a proper an explanation for you that made us sound better. I was moved to quote Tolstoy's quote, "All happy families resemble one another, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way." I suppose what I'm trying to say is that conflict isn't boring. And in my almost 30 years as a journalist, I've watched many newspapers, some of the right and some of the left, have their standards eroded, their funding eroded, and we move towards these Twitter-incited 24-hour news bursts of hate. We are casting more heat than light these days. Of course, this is a generalization, but it's absolutely the truth. I don't know what to do about the culture war. I think some of Cinder's suggestions were excellent, but I think in the end, we aren't going to be able to solve any of these issues unless we solve the important one in front of our eyes. I think we need political solutions to this problem. I don't think we can talk our way out of this. It really is, for me, bread and circuses. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you very much. Trevor, round is up.
Thank you very much, Bobby. I am, as you can see, away in a part of the country where these issues, to be honest, I don't think are much talked about here. If you go into the shopping centre where I am, where the most up-to-date thing that you will hear is Petula Clark singing Downtown, I don't think you're going to find many takers for this conversation. That doesn't mean it's not important. And entirely apart from the remarkably youthful looking 55 plus Ben Page trying to provoke someone who's just a tiny bit older than me. I think rudeness to pensioners, Ben, is the sort of thing that is absolutely unacceptable. I think that we need to be a bit careful in thinking that the premise of this conversation, that it can be called off, isn't the sort of delusion that people like us have, that actually if we stop talking about something, the rest of the country is going to stop being interested in it. That isn't the case. But we have to understand to some extent what does matter and what doesn't matter here. And if I may just make one passing reference, because the issue of battle and spend has been raised here, I completely agree with what was said about the utterly reprehensible conduct of some individuals there. And without question, George Galloway is going to be the top of the list there. But George Galloway didn't make this happen. George Galloway is an opportunist who can see where the opportunity exists. So those divisions in Batley and Spen are not of his making. He's just riding the wave. And the question that we have to ask ourselves really is, why do what are those divisions about? Now, are they just a distraction? I kind of agree with I think something Sundar said, but we need to, I wouldn't get too transfixed by the marginal issues. Statues and all that are rather entertaining. What portrait you have on the wall of an Oxford college that nobody's ever heard of really is quite good fun for us to write about, but actually it doesn't really matter very much. I also agree with what Ben said, I think, to the effect that when it comes to anger and all that, we're sort of a mid-table nation. We're the Leeds, Everton, Southampton of outrage. Actually, we're never that big. We're never that angry about anything. And in particular, we don't really like anybody trying to make us angry. We're suspicious of passion as a country. We talk about it a lot, but actually in this country, passion tends to be thought of as unreason and the enemy of pragmatism, which is a British characteristic. But there are divisions, and those divisions are about behaviours and norms, or to put it in a more pompous way, what is it like to be British? What are the behaviours and the norms that we recognise as common to Britain? And we're in a bit of panic about this. I mean, there's a sort of bizarre moment. I haven't really looked at any newspapers, but there's a bizarre moment when I saw a headline this morning, or a tweet this morning, sorry, of Labour objecting to a leaflet that's been put out, probably improperly, saying that Labour supports taking the knee. Now, what kind of panic are we in when the Labour Party, which does support taking the knee, complains about a leaflet that says Labour supports taking the knee? Now, that tells you that there is something important here, but that at least one party has no idea what it is. There is excitement about the issue of white privilege. And all I'd say about that is that it is, of course, one of the sort of slightly historical importations. There is such a thing as white privilege because it was statutorily ingrained in the United States. I mean, that's a point. That was the point of segregation. That's the point of civil rights. Actually, by law, white privilege existed. Of course, we've never had that here. So there's a sort of silliness about the use of the term, which doesn't, and something similar goes for structural racism and institutional racism. So there's another set of aspects here, which are about people using terms, to be frank, that they don't understand. But I want to take Bobby's point right at the very beginning here about the moderates. If everything I've said so far is true, you sort of expect people to go, oh, well, who cares? But actually, the moderates do care. It does matter to them. There is something that's animating interest in some of these issues. And I think the question that I would like to just address in my final few minutes is, what are they? I think there are some real issues. There is a real big issue. Nearly 30 years ago, James Carville said it's economy stupid. And what he meant there was that if identity, let's use shorthand here, identity and economics are driving are in the front seat of the car. Economics has historically, in my lifetime, had its hand on the driving seat. What is surprising and confusing perhaps is that in the last few years, it appears that identity has got hold of the driving seat. Now, why does that, what does that mean in practice? Well, it means that actually in terms of politics, there isn't a huge difference between left and right. Everybody wants to spend big. Everybody thinks that the state does have a role. Everybody wants to defend the NHS. But the things that divide people and that provide potency in politics are the ones where identity has its hands on the steering wheel. And why is that? I have to think two reasons. One big reason is technology and the disruption that is taking place. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. And second is geopolitics. And I'll be very straightforward about it. China matters. Let me take the first. I was president at a big retailer for 4 or 5 years. If you went to talk to any of the, we had 80,000 people working for us. You go and talk to the drivers and logistics in Preston. They aren't interested in any of the big issues, what we call the big issues. What they're interested in is the fact that within 5, 6 years, lorry drivers may be redundant because of technology. If you go and talk to the women on a cashier's desk or on a jewelry counter, what they're interested in is the fact that actually, probably within 18 months, there will be no cashiers. There will be no cashiers. And the two examples I've given right now count for about 4 million individuals in this country. Now, why does that matter in this conversation? If we think about the red wall seats, what's important about the red wall seats? The thing that they all have in common is very simple. They are all towns built on a single industry: mining, shipbuilding, some kinds of industry, steel, for example. When those industries departed or fell apart, we talked about it as though what was lost in those places was just jobs. So if we provide you with a new job on some godforsaken industrial estate 20 miles away from your village or from your town, then we've done our job in politics. Actually, no. For people who lived in those towns, let's say you're a miner, 6 days of the week, you're underground, you look the same as everybody else, you are the same as everybody else. On Saturday night, you're secretary of the miners' welfare. That's what gives you status, identity. What gives your family something. Your children go to the same school as the guy who's got the pick next to you. Something is similar in steelmaking. Something is similar in the docks. We're now in a situation where large parts of the country are not just economically disrupted, but they are culturally disrupted. They are in a completely different setting. Now, what politics, and I say all strike to politics, by the way, here, has not yet seemed to have got grasped, is that this issue of values, who we are, probably matters at least as much as a pound in your pocket. Hence, when we made the case, we Remainers, that Brexit would lose you money, people probably accepted that. But actually, there are things that are more important than money. And that's why this issue of culture becomes so important. And by the way, I haven't got time to go into China, except to say that all over the world, the Chinese are doing fantastically well. To give you a very simple example, I have a friend whose son went to Shanghai he's a Jamaican, went to Shanghai to take a look around the Chinese provided, or the tour and so on. He came back and he said to his father, "China is the future. It's fantastic. Look at what they're doing." And his father said, who is a minister of religion, said, "Yeah, but you can't worship there." And the son said, "Look, Dad, I understand that, but we can't survive on communion wafer." Actually, the issue of values and economics are bound up. And in our country, here's the example. Think about the biggest problem that we face right now. It's on Sajid Javid's inbox, social care. Well, Dilnot and so on have got had their model. Well, is that what it's really about? How much government should spend? Well, the model that Dilnot and others have developed is one which is of communal provision. All I can say from the point of view of my own family is that I would spend every penny I have, and indeed have done in times of my life, to avoid any older member of my family going into a care home. That is just not what we do. I just don't believe in it. It would be, I mean, it'll happen, I imagine, at some point. My children will probably put me in one. But in our family, with its values, it is a matter of shame. Why do I raise that? That's a minority view probably within a minority in this country. I understand that. But in Italy, it's the norm. The idea that you send your elders to put them in a care home is mad. So the model of social care that the cost of our social care and the way we fund it, we're having an argument about the money. Actually, the argument we should be having first is, what is the model that we think as a country is right for us? And that's, frankly, a cultural issue. It is not a Whitehall, Westminster issue. It is a people issue about what kind of people we are. Last point, Ben raised the issue of class, and I think this is incredibly important. In this country, when we think about class, we don't just mean income. We mean all kinds of other things. And I think we need to sort that out in our minds, because the culture arguments actually overlap with this issue of class. It's not just money, it's who and what kind of person we aspire to be. Last point, I'm not quite sure if I understood Sunder properly, but if I did, I agree with him that the actual basic idea that we should call off the culture wars, because underlying all of this, there's a sort of basic agreement that sensible people will share, is just not true. There are some people in this country who have a very different view to the view I hold about, let us say, women's status or homosexuality. I do not want to make common cause with those people. I will always be at war with them. Now, the question is, where do we stand on that? I don't want to call off some of these wars, because actually I think some people are just wrong. And that's why I think, we might feel uncomfortable about it, but actually this thing does matter. It really does matter, because these culture wars aren't just about trivial nonsense. They are about what kind of people we want to be. I'll shut up now.
Brilliant. That's great, Trevor. I mean, it puts me in mind of the great work that Anne Case and Angus Deaton did in the US about the decline of white, lower educated groups within the US, which is much more about the end of a way of life than pure economic effects. And that type of interaction between economics and culture, and what values and what you think your society is for, is just is crucial to understand these sorts of trends. I think if we can just pick up on that point about, have we got the wrong frame in calling off culture wars? I guess it depends on what we mean by that. And I think there's some great work by Kirsty McNeil and others looking at, are you here to win it? Are you here to win a culture war, or end it before it starts? And I think that is an important distinction between a culture war and cultural disagreement. And because there's always going to be disagreement in values and culture. So I'm just going to group some questions together around that kind of theme, and then and then people can react to the other panelists' points, and as well as try and get to these sorts of questions. One thing I should say is there's 7 recommendations within the final report about how we approach this. And it's a range of different things, from how we frame the debate to what we can actually practically do. So it's worth looking at the 7 things that we came up with from looking. I'll put 3 sorts of things together. So great presentation, researchers and feedback. Interesting whether there are interventions you come across in other countries to address this type of cultural division, and how effective they are in finding common ground and moderating rather than escalating culture wars. Then related to that, how do we organize the stronger middle that Sunda mentioned? What's the role of schools, education, civil society, other types of groups in those types of debate, those types of actions? And is there any way to create more productive discussions about these difficult cultural issues at a national level? So effectively, what have we got the right framing, and what are the actions? Sunda, you look keen to go. I'm keen to hear.
Yeah. Don't put too much on schools. I think people always say, let schools sort it out if we get it right with the next generation. Schools have actually done really well on this stuff. You know, something Trevor's talking about there, you know, do we have fundamental norms? You've got to get the boundaries and the foundations right here. You can't have equal respect and disagreeing well if some people don't have any status in that conversation because you're an ethnic minority or because you're gay or because you're women. So there are some foundations there, and these issues get shot. Now, schools have done really well on that, but you've actually got quite a big intergenerational cleavage in our society between the young and the old in the centre of gravity on these issues. So actually the answer isn't in schools, it's actually to bridge the generational conversation and the geographic conversation outside of the educational system. And you know, the thing that gives people confidence about interethnic relations in the long term is that people talk about how their children navigate those issues better than generation did and better than their parents' generation did. But actually, if you've got a big intergenerational divide, you need to create spaces of meaningful contact outside of it. What the political parties do will really, really matter. Because if they lean into speaking to this third of the country and speaking to that third of the country, that will structure what a lot of other people do. So you've got to make it in their interests to not do that. In the short term, and Tanya was saying this, I think, in the short term, the left is in trouble. If you're part of this more liberal group, your political coalition isn't broad enough. You've got to broaden it. And so you should pursue your causes in a way that broadens it. In the long term, I think the right is in trouble if it pursues the policies of culture. Well, you see it in those generational issues. The right should go back to the city, should go back to broadening across ethnic groups, should span the generational divide. So it feels to me that the left needs to pursue its causes in a way that appeals to the balancer middle. And the right in Britain, it needs to be quite politically correct in its objections to political correctness. It can make objections to excessive wokeness if it's accepted the foundations of the progress we've made on exactly the foundations that Trevor wanted to pursue.
Thank you, Sunda. Ben.
I mean, I think what the data and observations suggests is it's probably, and it's difficult with a media that is desperate for attention, has declining audiences in many cases, a media that sees widespread fragmentation of audiences where you have to shout ever louder to get attention. So there are countervailing forces, but in terms of the things that unite people, there's a number of factors, and I'll build on something Sunda said. I think the first is it's finding those things, whether it's football, heritage, things like the Olympics opening ceremony. Those are things that actually unite people, and they recognize that. I'm fascinated that in Britain today, in 2021, exactly the same proportion of Britons, despite the profile of the population changing quite markedly, which I'll come to, exactly the same proportion of Britons as in the late 20th century say the best thing about this country is heritage. Now, of course, we can go into what that actually means, and it means different things to different people. But I think I would agree with Sunda that in the long run, generational change is coming. One of the most striking statistics I find when I go and ask people, what do you know about Britain? 1 in 3 children at school are from an ethnic minority. And that means that in 20 years, Britain is going to look and feel quite different. Sunda's already remarked on the very steep age gradient on attitudes on some of these issues, which if young people don't change their views and become suddenly move to the opposite extreme, then Britain is going to shift to being a bit more liberal in the longer term. In the short term, I think the war on woke is good politics for the Conservatives, unfortunately, particularly when Labour is weak. And it's part of one of the problems with the moderate middle. It's a bit like being a social democrat. I'm a sort of with a small s and a small d. I'm a sort of really cross and angry social democrat. It doesn't really sort of work. So I think there's a real challenge with the moderate middle. But things like the British Empire work for the Conservative Party because actually most people who vote Conservative, if they live in a former mill town or down south and are a prosperous banker, either way, they are united in the idea that the British Empire is something you should be proud of. And the challenge and why it works for the Conservative Party so well is that Labour, like a lot of Britain, is actually divided on that issue. There are lots of traditional Labour voters who are still very proud of the British Empire, but there's lots of younger, newer ones who are very angry about the British Empire. And then there's lots of in both parties, of course, who say you should be neither proud nor ashamed. So I do think that unfortunately culture wars works for number 10. in many ways. And so that is a challenge. I absolutely agree with Trevor that, culture, there's a quote from my favorite management consultant, culture eats strategy for breakfast and then has structure for lunch. But actually you could apply that to, at the moment, to our politics. Economics, it should, in theory, it ought to be economics, but it isn't at the moment. But I think I would agree that in the short term, this may well continue, and it works for political reasons for the right. In the longer term, it looks as though in the way that Britain has changed since the Second World War, Britain will go on changing and will carry on becoming actually more liberal with a small L in the longer term, simply because of compositional effects. I will shut up.
Yeah, just to pick up on that point, just before we move on to Trevor and Tanya, because there is, I'm going back to Sunder's point about each side sees their side as having a legitimate discussion on this. And I kind of like, that's the sort of, I've got two thoughts on this, I suppose, is actually the extent to which the issues that are being picked up in politics are important emblems of a deeper concern about culture change, which is how one side will see it, versus this is actually just picking on extreme examples. And that's a really hard thing to separate, which ones are legitimate, which ones are just, political tactics. And I kind of, because I absolutely, from a generational perspective, culture change never stops. It keeps moving on. I think the one thing that I'd say about, we will never get to a settlement in the future where we're more liberal, or because the issues move on and everything moves on. So we always, but what I worry about and what the concern about this is, I think, is when you base a division around something that is related to generations, you never get to a stable majority. You always get to this pretty much down the middle division, because you're always getting this renewal of younger people coming through with more, and then you always have to have more extreme appeals to a shrinking base. And that is the story of the US, the more extreme appeals to a shrinking base because of a shift in a coalition of the ascendant, as they would call it in the US. So it's sort of, I think it can be more stable a system, then there's going to be a solution in the end, a more stable system of conflict, I guess, which is the
That's
one.
an interesting way of putting it. No, I mean, although one does wonder, we won't, nobody on this call will be around to see it, of course, exactly how, if the young are always going to be more liberal than, people in their 40s, 50s or 60s, what exactly is it going to look like in 100 years time? But I mean, I'd love, but anyway, let's see.
Yeah. Trevor or Tanya, you want to come in? Tanya.
Well, obviously, there's not going to be one solution. I did have a couple of ideas. I wish, beyond all things, that politicians would get off Twitter. I mean, I wish everybody would get off Twitter, but politicians particularly.
It's got out of the bag. I don't think you can put it back.
Well, I don't know why they can't organise some kind of guidelines, because it's not governing, it's spasming. Entire news cycles, are sucked up into, frankly, meaningless drivel. And so I can't blame voters for being absolutely turned off. And I think there's been a real decline in the political class. And I think, again, also the media, and now social media, is partly to blame. We make it intolerable for these people. And so who rises? People who are so tough, probably much too tough to be very good at what they're doing. And I had another thought, which was huge divisions in this country along class and money, as we've said. But what do we share? What does everybody in this country have? We have a democracy. And if we're going to worship something, I suggest it isn't bunting or a monarchy or a picture of the Queen. It could be our democracy. I would like to see so much more of that. I met a woman in Batley and Spen who was in her 70s, who had never been in a polling booth. And I wonder whether there's something in that.
Thank you, Tanya. Trevor.
Well, I don't have too much to add. A couple of points. First of all, practical thing everybody should do: read Bobby Duffy's book Generations, which I think illuminates a great deal of these issues. And if I may trade quotes with Ben, you're right, culture eats strategy for breakfast. The other relevant slogan here is culture lies upstream of politics. It's one of the things that the right has really grasped, and the left basically cannot get its head out of its backside about. Part of the reason that Trump was able to do what he was able to do was because he caught on to the, what people loosely call the zeitgeist in a way that Clinton basically didn't. Trump rode the wave. Clinton basically told people what the wave ought to be rather than what it actually was. And then was surprised when people said, sorry, we're on a different surfboard, mate. Sorry, I'm taking metaphors into ridiculous territory. What can we do? Well, first of all, I think there is an issue for the left here. But part of the big problem is at the moment, there is no apparent project from the Labour Party. There literally is no Labour project. At the moment, the Labour position is Tories are bad. And that's it. Unfortunately, a large part of the country doesn't buy that, certainly not in the way that that it is being meant. I think the problem for progressives about all of this is that actually a lot of the things that we apparently want to change are things that the country likes and that the country doesn't really, even if it doesn't feel that strongly about them, doesn't really see any need to mess about with when there are other things that need to be addressed. Who really needs to change the flag? I mean, honestly, is that going to get anybody? Who really needs to teach children? We can't seem to teach children to be able to read and write when at 11, but we're going to spend a lot of time telling them about something called white privilege. I mean, give me a break. I think that the problem for the left is that we've fallen prey, forgive me as a massive old lefty for quoting Engels. Engels said that about a group of frankly ultra-leftists, that they think that when they've changed the name of the thing, they have changed the thing. And he then went on to say these gentlemen are making a mockery of politics. And I think he's right. At the moment, the left's position is, if we can change the words, then we'll actually change the thing. Most people know that's nonsense. And the third thing I will just say, just on the point about ethnic minorities, it's sort of right, but let's remember ethnic minorities are not, number one, they're not a single group, and number two, they are not, if you like, they're going to change.
Yeah.
40 years ago, pretty much anybody who was not white would vote Labour. Today, I don't know what the numbers are. I haven't seen data from the last election.
It was actually still 60% actually at the last. It's one of the
I was going to say overall.
But that may, as you say, Trevor, that historical alliance may also change over time with age.
What I was going to say, Ben, is that if you disentangle the groups, you will probably find that the biggest single group of ethnic minorities, who are those of Indian heritage, you will probably find the majority are voting Conservative right now, which is why, for example, Sean Bailey and was able to beat Sadiq Khan in Brenton, Harrow, and the other Northwest London, because that's the biggest concentration of that group. Yeah. So let's remember that ethnic minorities will change, and by the way, so will Tories. 10 years ago, the Tories came in wanting to get rid of the Equality Act. Even Liz Truss right now, can you imagine Liz Truss saying, I want to get rid of the Equality Act? Ain't going to happen. So let's remember that both the electorate and the political parties are changing.
Brilliant. So we've got limited time left, but it's a good segue into the kind of final group of questions, which are future focused, really. And I'm going to roll together a couple, and this is your kind of final round of the panel to get off the call on time. So it's around media and politics then, I guess, because it is worth we had a lot of questions, great questions from the audience. Thank you for all of your interaction on that. And a lot of recognition of the characteristic that we're describing about a very difficult media and social media environment that's incentivized in particular ways to accentuate the extremes. But a couple of specific things is questions around what role do you think the BBC has to play as an institution to bridge those divides, and then a specific point from Tim Cross on if the platforms were forced to identify people themselves more, would that help? Or are there other kind of solutions from a social media perspective that people can think of? Can we actually change this information environment? And then second group of questions, but I'll just put it into one, is relating this to Brexit. People question is around, is this not so much a 5-year hangover about who won, but a proxy for identity for traditional views versus progressive views, which I think lots of people on this panel would agree with. But then the future bit is, if so, what does that mean for the future of party politics? This Brexit identity interacting with party political identities. What does that say for the future? So those two things: what's the media things that we can do looking forward, and what does it mean for party politics? And we've only got a minute each for it to cover those small questions. Ben, let's go in panel.
All right, very quickly then. So the BBC retains is still the most trusted media source in Britain. I think its job, of course, is therefore to speak truth to the audience about the fact that other people won't agree with them, and to, in fact, to run a brilliant programme hosted by Bobby Duffy on these issues. On Tim Cross's point about identifying people on social media, and I've been engaging with our COVID work this year, which many people on this call may have been asked to take part in, and for which thank you, in terms of testing for COVID. I have engaged with the anti-vaxxers and the COVID deniers, and it's true that if they can ever become human rather than anonymous identity, they're rather different. But so I personally would like everybody to be forced to be identified via a photo, passport photo or something, before they were allowed online. I fear also it's not going to happen, but it certainly would make people more civilized. And I think that will have to do for me for now, with your time pressure, Bobby.
No worries. Sunda.
I think it's a good question about the BBC. There's a limit to how much you should lecture the partisan media on what it wants to do. But the public service broadcasters, all of them, we pay for them and we regulate them to provide a space for conversation that the market would not provide. And so I think really digging into this question of public engagement and discourse, the BBC is incredibly important here, and it is probably a big reason we are not like America, because there are moments when, and ITV does it as well, of course, 20 million of us will still watch the same football match, the same royal event, and so on. And that's really important in a world where everything else gets fragmented. But they should surface this issue more. Who are you sharing a society with across the nations of the UK, across ethnic groups? And that sort of mediated contact for people who don't have contact is actually really important, but it has to be at less soundbite based. So I think that's one of the really important places where some of this could actually happen and be seen to happen. And if you then localize that, let's have conversations about race in Bristol that bridge, a very divided city in lots of different ways. Let's have conversations about class in Liverpool or in Manchester and how that brings in. I think the BBC is there to do that and should really lean into this, because there's a big market and appetite for it among the public, but you need to actually engage people. You need to trust the public more here. And I think Liberals don't trust the public, partly so they think they'll bring back the death penalty, and partly because just of the discombobulating effect of the Brexit vote. And actually, the public have moved a long way, are actually very liberal on these issues. There is a political correctness point that 7 out of 10 people think political correctness is a problem. 7 out of 10 people think hate speech is a problem as well. So the balances really are balances. They think the platforms are leaving up stuff that is terrible and that could come off, at the same time that they think we're being bonkers in engaging with trivia about episodes of Fawlty Towers. So there's a real cost to engaging with trivia and getting the reputation of engaging with trivia, and not actually policing boundaries that really matter about racism, hatred and violence.
Thank you, Sunda. That's great. And Tanya.
The thing I love most about the BBC is that the right wing think it's left wing and the left wing think it's right wing, which implies to me that it's probably doing a very good job and is one of the only media outlets in the country that I'm not ashamed of. Most of the attacks on the BBC are from its commercial rivals. We need to be absolutely clear on this. Regarding Twitter, I think names, it's a start. The first politician who's going to boycott Twitter, I will follow onto the gates of hell. And we definitely need more speech in this country, but not there and like this.
Thank you, Tanya. And Trevor.
In defense of Twitter, which is not something you hear very often, I am pleased to say, not because it's anything to do with me, but because I thought it was an important thing. There's a clip of a show that I present that's been viewed 1 million times on Twitter in the last 48 hours. And I think it was an important thing for people in this country to have their pain recognised. On the questions you asked, on the BBC, look, I think 2 things. One is BBC needs to stop just stop telling us about its values. I really don't give a shit. I don't care whether BBC is nice or not. I want it just to tell me, do its basic job, which is to tell me what this nation is like, what is normal here. And one way in which it can start to do that is to be more diverse in its own constitution, in a sense. It needs to stop creating itself as an institution that tells everybody, you know, what is right and righteous and proper. In a sense, you know, Auntie basically is constantly trying on her niece's stiletto heels. Be boring. Just be ordinary for once. You know, the big test for Tim Davie is that in 2 years' time, would somebody who is themselves a Brexiteer, let's say, feel comfortable working at the BBC? At the moment, that's never going to be true. Now, just start with that. Make it a place where there is true diversity of opinion, and then a lot will follow. And on the other point, I do want to make a point about this traditional versus progressive views. I suppose everybody knows what they mean by traditional, but I am not sure that I agree with what is currently labelled progressive points of view. What is progressive about treating, for example, village life in this country as though it's sort of a bit old-fashioned and really you need to get out of it? What is progressive about deciding to erase women as a sex because you're going to put the pronouns here or there? I don't get that those things are progressive. At the heart of any kind of progressive project has to be solidarity, and some of the kinds of things that claim to be progressive, which are basically about punishing people who come from the left or come from working backgrounds, for punishing people for not following the orthodoxy, seem to me completely the opposite of progressive thinking. So this issue of traditional versus progressive, I'm not sure I completely buy it, and I don't completely buy it because I think that we, by which I conclude myself, on the progressive end of politics, have basically lost the sense of who we are and what progressive values really feel like.
Thank you for that, and thank you everyone for their contributions. I'm sorry we've run 3 minutes over time, which is my bad chairing, but I do really appreciate people taking time out of their day in the audience to come to an event like this, particularly on today, when a day that's probably been shortened by people, for many of you, having to go to watch a football match at 5 p.m, where Bukayo Saka will fulfill his glorious purpose, I am sure, as a true Arsenal fan. So just want to thank the team who worked on the report. Brilliant work across Kings and Ipsos Mori generally, British Future for the support of the event, Unbound Philanthropy for their support throughout, the team who put together the event today, Rebecca and George, and finally our excellent panelists. Thank you so much for taking the time today. Really great discussion. Thank you all.